Okay. Let me just, all right. Okay. Outside of ham radio, one of the things I do is I am a docent at the Museum of Ventura County. And when they found out that I liked to write or had a background in writing, they asked me if I would start doing historical articles that featured aspects of the collection that we have at the Museum of Ventura County. And so I've been doing that for the last umpteen years and have written a bunch of stories. And the one I'm going to share with you tonight took place 102 years ago. It was when a tragic mix of poor judgment, distrust of new technology, navigation mistakes, irregular currents, and thick fog led to the loss of 23 lives. It was 100 miles north of Ventura. The wrecks are on a dangerous stretch of the Central Coast that has captured the attention of Venturans for weeks. Families would actually pack lunches and hike to the cliffs to look down on what became the largest peacetime loss of U.S. Navy ships, and to this day. It was Saturday, September 8th, 1923, and in less than 5 minutes, 7 naval destroyers ran aground on the jagged rocks and reefs of Honda Point, which is just off the present-day Vandenberg Space Force Base. Located near the entrance to the Santa Barbara Channel, Honda Point, also known as Point Pedernales, had been feared by mariners since the 16th century. The Spanish explorers first called the area the Mandibula del Diablo, or the Devil's Jaw. And as you can see, noted on the top left of this current maritime map, this section of the California coast is still considered a dangerous area for mariners. And I think some of our local sailors, Bill Wilcox, will testify to that. I know my father-in-law, who was quite the sailor, really dreaded going by this particular part of the coast. You were glad when you got by it. So the destroyers were part of a 14-ship squadron. They were all relatively new Clemson-class destroyers, which was a series of 156 destroyers that were commissioned by the Navy between 1919 and 1922. This is a picture of 6 of them being built. The ships had steel hulls and were a few yards longer than a football field. They could carry a crew of 131 sailors, but just like today, due to budget cuts, the ships in our story had crews of only about 100. This is a picture of the USS Delphi, which will play a very important role in the story that you're about to hear. The 14 ships of Destroyer Squadron 11 left San Francisco at 8:30 on that Saturday morning for a high-speed training run to San Diego. They had just 24 hours to complete tactical and gunnery exercises, something the Navy hadn't attempted since the end of World War I. Their commander was 49-year-old Captain Edward H. Watson. He led from his flagship, the Delphi, which you just looked at a picture of, and there we go. I'm going to the right place. He was a Naval Academy graduate. He was the son of an admiral, and he had been in the service for 28 years and seemed to be just one promotion away from becoming an admiral himself. So this was a rare peacetime chance for him to prove how skillful he was at sea. So to stay on schedule, Watson kept the ships in a tight formation and ran them at about 20 knots, which is about 23 miles per hour, which is a fast pace for a 300-foot destroyer and quicker than most of them had run in many, many years. Another squadron was taking part in a similar exercise, but they were moving along slower, so Watson knew that he was in the lead with his squadron. Now, the Pacific was unusually rough on that day because just a week earlier and 5,000 miles away, a massive 7.9 magnitude earthquake had ripped through the main island, Japan's main island of Honshu. It devastated Tokyo and Yokohama and claimed more than 100,000 lives. The earthquake sent powerful shock waves across the Pacific. Its immense energy stirred the ocean and created long rolling swells and unpredictable currents that reached all the way to the California coast, and that helped set the stage for disaster. As the squadron's flagship, the Delphi was responsible for navigation. She carried the Navy's newest technology, which was a radio direction finder or a radio compass. This is a picture of a unit from 1920. In 1923, very few ships had this equipment, and even fewer commanders trusted it. The captains were used to relying on the stars or charts or their own experience, and not on mysterious signals coming from the air. The new radio compasses were temperamental. On the large steel warships, the masts and other metal caused radiation errors. Sounds like field day. That distorted the radio signals, and it would throw off the bearings. Each reading had to be carefully calibrated and corrected by skilled operators, and a single mistake could send the ship miles off of course. And unlike a magnetic compass, the device demanded constant attention, and also even the ship's surface could play tricks on the signal. It could create a distortion and twist the radio signals and confuse the results. But still aboard the Delphi, the radio compass locked onto a signal from the station at Port Arguello, a reading that would later prove to be critical. These early radio direction finders used a simple loop antenna, which you saw in the earlier picture, and it was rotated by the operator. These signals, these antennas picked up signals in a figure-8 pattern that you can see there, and it caused what's known as the 180-degree ambiguity problem. The equipment couldn't tell whether the signal was coming from the front or the back of the loop. And the strongest signal occurred when the loop faced the transmitter, and the weakest, or the null, happened when the loop was turned 90 degrees to it. Now, the operators preferred using the nulls to calculate where they were because it gave a sharper and more precise direction. The problem was that there are two nulls absolutely opposite each other. So, for example, if the null pointed to 90 degrees or east, the signal could just as easily be coming from 270 degrees of the west. The antenna couldn't tell which side the signal was on. And at sea, this created serious risks in fog or darkness. The captain, using a shore beacon to find a harbor, might mistakenly steer 180 degrees in the wrong direction, sailing away from safety instead of towards it. So, this problem was eventually solved in the mid-1920s by adding a second non-directional sense antenna. When its signal was combined precisely with the loop signal, it canceled one side of the figure-8 pattern. So you can see that's been taken out of the equation, leaving a unidirectional or cardioid sort of target, a heart-shaped pattern that indicated the true direction. The sense antenna was typically a simple vertical wire antenna, often mounted on the same mast as the structure holding the loop antenna. It looked like a standard thin metal rod or wire extending upwards. The U.S. Navy went on to significantly expand its coastal network of shore-based radio direction finding stations around 1924. The stations had better equipment, stable environments, and dedicated, highly trained operators. And instead of the ship getting its own potentially inaccurate bearing, the ship began transmitting a signal, and then two or more shore stations would basically triangulate that signal and take the bearings. Then the shore stations would radio back to the ship exactly where their position was. In 1928, the network was robust enough that captains could reliably obtain a fix from the shore station within just minutes, offering a level of accuracy and reliability that shipboard equipment could not match at the time. In 1930, when this newspaper ad was appeared, the compass was still kind of bulky, as you can see, but it was being marketed for smaller non-military craft, such as yachts. But all this innovation would come years after the captain of the Delphi made some very tragic decisions. Captain Watson didn't believe the radio navigation signals were coming from Point Arguello. And he didn't want to slow down and miss his deadline. So Watson and his navigator relied on the traditional method of determining the fleet's position, which is something called dead reckoning. It's one of the oldest ways to navigate at sea. The ship's navigator estimates the vessel's current position by starting from a known point and then tracking its speed, direction, and the time traveled. For example, the navigator knows the ship left the harbor at noon, heading west or 270 degrees at 10 knots. Typical currents get factored in, but basically after an hour, the ship is estimated to be 10 nautical miles west of the harbor where it left. However, dead reckoning doesn't account for unusually strong currents, winds, steering errors, and other factors. So over time, the position can drift from the shore of the ship's true location, especially when there's poor visibility or rough seas. In the case of the Delphi, the dead reckoning estimated the ship's position based on what the speed that they believed they were going, which I told you was 20 knots, and its heading. But the unusual swells and currents after the earthquake may have cut the ship's actual speed to as little as 12 knots, making the calculations completely wrong. The fleet was several miles off of course, and coupled with darkness and heavy fog, Captain Watson didn't know that they were positioned right near the mouth of the Devil's Jaw. At 9 p.m., Captain Watson ordered his ships to turn east, believing they were safely entering the Santa Barbara Channel. Instead, the Delphi headed straight into a heavy fog bank, and 5 minutes later, she slammed into jagged rocks at full speed. The impact ripped open her hull, and the ship rolled onto her side, as you can see. Fires erupted in the engine room, trapping men below. On deck, sailors were thrown into the sea. The ruptured fuel tanks from the ship poured oil across the water and created a thick 5-inch slick that made swimming nearly impossible. Some crewmen fought their way to the rocks, others became stuck in the oily sludge and had to be pulled back onto the side of the ship. 2 of them drowned. The Oxnard Press Courier newspaper told the tragic story of fireman J.T. Pearson. He had leaped into the water to rescue his shipmates, but he was hauled back on board when his glasses were shattered, his eyes were blinded by the glass and the oil. He was terrified and disoriented. He couldn't even grab onto a rescue rope. And the oil slick deck made it too dangerous for them to try to have others come and help him. So what the crew did is they tied him to a deck house and they hoped to save him at daylight. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the night. The newspaper said the sailors were haunted by the frantic calls of the crazed victims piercing the night, and Pearson became the 3rd sailor from the Delphi to die. Crew members sounded the Delphi's siren to alert the ships that were dutifully following her lead, but it was too late. This is the USS SP Lee, only a few football fields behind the Delphi, but it turned left to avoid hitting the Delphi, but ran aground in shallow water. Her propellers were destroyed by the impact, and within minutes the ship was pushed on shore. The ship's hull was ripped open, and she had to be abandoned. Despite the blaring warning sirens, the USS Young, wait a minute. I'm sorry, yeah, the USS Young had no time to turn before she struck the rocks. The impact ripped her hull open from bow to stern. Water poured into the engine room, the power failed, and within moments the destroyer rolled onto her side and sank. Dozens of sailors were hurled into the dark, oily sea. Some tried to swim 100 yards to shore through the waves that were, as I said, thick with fuel and jagged rocks, but most turned back and they climbed onto the overturned hull for safety. Clinging onto the slick port side of the ship, they smashed open portholes with a fire axe to find something that they could hold onto with their hands, and also to create some air pockets. Below deck, men trapped in their bunks or in the engine and boiler room fought to escape the rising water. About 80 sailors were clinging to the shattered portholes on the side of the ship. Many of them were barefoot, still wearing the clothes they'd been sleeping in, and some were tied together so that no one would be swept away. By dawn, though, 20 of the young sailors were dead. Spotting the breakers ahead, the captain of the USS Woodbury tried to turn, but the destroyer slammed broadside into the rocky island, ripping open her hull. As she settled against the rocks, the seawater poured into the engine rooms. Again, according to the Oxnard Press Courier, the men below stayed at their post. They worked in rising water up to their shoulders in a desperate attempt to keep the ship's lights burning. The pounding surf tore mercilessly at the crippled vessel. Realizing that she could not be saved, the crew abandoned the ship and climbed down the jagged rock that would soon be named Woodbury Island, and you can see the island there. They waited there through the night to be rescued the next morning. Above the Woodbury is the USS Nicholas. She struck bottom before she could turn, damaged her rudder and propeller. Out of control, she hit the bottom several more times before becoming wedged in these rocks right there. And her hull was torn open by the impact. It quickly flooded, and with the waves sweeping over their deck, the crew was supposed to evacuate that ship as well. The USS Fuller couldn't stop in time either, but a desperate last-second turn spared her from a head-on collision. Even so, the maneuver came too late to save her completely. One side of her hull was ripped open by the impact, and it was clear that she would go down once the surf dragged her free of the rocks. So realizing the danger, the crew scrambled overboard and made it onto the rocks, onto the shoreline, which was fairly close. This is the USS Chauncey. While it avoided the rocks, it clipped the Young, tore open its hull, and ran onto the shore with enough force to ride several feet out of the water. With the ship stuck fast and relatively safe, only 25 yards from the shore, the crew went to rescue other sailors in the water near the capsized Young. You can see the Young oops, push the wrong button here. You can, oops, what did I do? Hold on, let me get back, okay. You can see the Young right here, faintly on the right. Eventually the pounding surf began to break up the Chauncey, and it too had to be abandoned. So this picture here was taken from a biplane, and it gives you a good illustration of the sequence of events. So you'll see the Delphi running aground in the top center of the photo, followed by the Lee, which turned left to avoid hitting the Delphi. Next comes the Young, which didn't have a chance to turn. Then you see the Woodbury hit the island. The out-of-control Nicholas smashed on top, up on the top left, and the Fuller hit the rocks in front of the Woodbury. And finally, the Chauncey is up on the shore on the right. So you see you can follow the sequence there. And this is all happening in just a matter of minutes. So two ships, the Farragut and the Somers, managed to act in time. They reversed their engines and slowed down and grounded kind of gently into the sand, and they were undamaged and both backed up safely into deeper water. Another commander, Walter G. Roper, who was leading 5 destroyers at the rear of the column, had intercepted the same radio direction finding signal that the Delphi ignored, and using those bearings, he realized the squadron was off course. And when they reached the turning point, Roper became one of the heroes of our story when he deliberately slowed down and then stopped his ships. He was technically disobeying orders, but he saved them all from disaster. Ahead of him, the scene was catastrophic. In minutes, the US Navy had lost more ships than in all of World War I. The broken hulls leaked 300,000 gallons of oil into the sea. Lifeboats from the undamaged ships were rushed in to help, and local ranchers on the cliffs rigged breeches buoys. And you can see a sailor in the breeches buoy. They were kind of life rings with canvas seats strung on ropes, and you know, kind of like zip lining, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I laid on my thumb too hard there. The breeches buoy is, you know, it's kind of like zip lining, I guess. And there is a story of a chief boatswain's mate, Arthur Peterson, who performed one of the night's most heroic acts. He swam through the thick oil-choked water from the Young to the Chauncey. He carried a line attached to a floating ring, and that rope became a lifeline that was used to rig rafts and rescue 80 sailors that were clinging to the overturned Young. Remember, I told you how everybody was hanging onto the side of that. Peterson made 11 trips through the surf before the last man was saved, and he was later cited for bravery. Fishing boats, local fishing boats joined in the rescue, pulling men from the wrecks, and some sailors actually made their way to shore on their own, though they had to crawl over the very sharp rocks that are in the area there. The Oxnard Press Courier reported, and this is a quote, "In the pitch blackness, 14 shivering, oil-smeared refugees of the Delphian Young, some naked, others in nightshirts, were loaded aboard a Southern Pacific train early Sunday morning and taken to Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. Most were barely conscious, and they were in shock." Another newspaper, the Ventura Morning Free Press, added that one of the injured was a man named J.M. Mays, who was somewhat of a celebrity. He was a former Ventura resident and had become one of the first locals to volunteer for World War I service. He was lucky to survive, especially since he was asleep in his bunk when the ship hit the rocks. By Sunday afternoon, the last sailors were rescued. A special train carried hundreds of exhausted, oil-covered men back to San Diego. Many were cut and bruised from crawling over the jagged rocks. And over the next 2 days or so, 800 sailors were treated, fed, clothed, and finally taken by train back to San Diego. 18 sailors were left behind to guard the wrecks. They were tasked with protecting the stranded destroyers from looters and watching for the bodies of the fallen shipmates. By Monday, only a few bodies had been recovered. The pounding surf made it nearly impossible to reach those that they believed were still trapped inside the Young's overturned hull. On Wednesday, wrecking crews could finally cut holes, openings large enough in the Young's side, and they were hoping to find the missing men, but not a single body was discovered. Investigators later concluded the sailors had escaped the sinking ship, but probably drowned in the raging seas as they tried to reach shore. Within days, reports were spreading that the ocean currents were carrying bodies towards Ventura County. The sheriff at the time was a man named Bob Clark, and he spent hours searching the Rincon coast, where it was reported that the bodies were washing ashore. He scouted the area for 2 days before he concluded that it was fake news. The Navy ships patrolled the Santa Barbara Channel after another rumor claimed that 3 missing men were adrift on a raft near Wilson Rock, 3 miles from San Miguel Island. Fearing the raft might be tossing helplessly at sea, the rescuers searched for days but found nothing. By the end of the week, 17 bodies had been recovered and 6 men were never found. It's believed that they were carried out to sea. Even as the search continued, danger remained. Looters tried to reach the grounded ships, and armed guards had to fire warning shots across the bows of two small boats that ignored their orders to leave the wreck of the Nicholas. According to the reports, two intruders were hit and another jumped overboard to escape in the surf. So 6 days after the disaster, a Navy captain arrived to take command of the salvage operation. Recovery crews were already at work hauling in lifeboats, ropes, and scattered deck gear. But the truth was clear: that 7 destroyers were damaged beyond saving, and they were declared a total loss. The Ventura Weekly Post and Democrat estimated their combined value at $10.5 million. Now that's in 1923, that's over $187 million today. With the ships doomed to be broken apart by the relentless surf, the Navy focused on rescuing what it could. They picked up weapons, radios, documents, and equipment. They even managed to salvage torpedo tubes, small guns, and vital records. Using tractors, they even pulled torpedoes out of the water. But the sea was far too dangerous to recover any of the heavy guns or equipment that was on the ships that were lying farther offshore. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this was kind of a big deal for Ventura County residents who saw it as, hey, let's go see the shipwreck. They first learned of the disaster in Monday morning's newspapers, and immediately the curious began plotting on how they could see the wreck for themselves. The journey to Honda Point was no easy feat. It was a 100-mile drive that proved to be too much for many. Several motorists set out Monday only to become stuck in the sand. They were trying to go right up the coast, which was never a good idea. They got stuck in the sand. Others pressed on. They would drive to Lompoc and then take a rugged road to the coastal town of Surf, from which they would then face a 7-mile hike to the wreck site. Travelers were warned not to even attempt this route unless they had full confidence in their car. And again, you know, what confidence that we have in our car today compared to what we had, cars in 1923 is a major difference. The hike eventually became unnecessary when the Southern Pacific Railroad arranged for 2 trains to stop at a point just 5 minutes from the wreck site. The railroad had been reluctant to provide special service, feeling that it might appear that they were exploiting what was the greatest disaster that had ever befallen the United States Navy. Yet pressure from eager onlookers prevailed. By Wednesday, following the disaster, Venturans could board a northbound train at 10:30 in the morning, arrive at Honda Point by 1:19, and spend 3 hours at the wreck, and then return via Santa Barbara to Ventura, leaving the wreck site at about 4:30. With the train bypassing the more treacherous stretches, hundreds of Ventura County residents were expected to make the pilgrimage that Sunday. As you can see, the newspaper even published tips from the Automobile Club on the best train and car routes. The round-trip train fare was $7, which is roughly $125 in today's real money. The Ventura Free Press reported that thousands of people went to Honda Point that Sunday by auto and train. In Ventura alone, Southern Pacific sold 24 round-trip tickets, while hundreds of cars made their way to Lompoc and Surf to meet the train. The newspaper described the scene at the wreck as unforgettable. Their quote was, "They were not disappointed by the awe-inspiring sight of Uncle Sam's great ships pitted up on the rocks, some upright, others in pieces, and still others breaking up. The visitors came from across the county. More than 20 couples and their children traveled from Oxnard that day. For the next month, the county newspapers, which typically celebrated comings and goings of famous and semi-famous people and even relatives in the newspaper in kind of their I guess their local columns. And the idea to see the wreck appeared in in columns such as clubs, fraternal, social, and women's interests. There were 36 members of the Oxnard Oddfellows Lodge that combined an initiation ceremony with a trip at the wreck site. The wreck even inspired some more dramatic adventures. My favorite was teenage sweethearts from Ventura were emboldened after visiting Honda Point. They traveled straight to San Luis Obispo and decided they'd get married. They told the clerk they were 21 and 18, but later admitted they had acted hastily, likely due to the furious reaction of the bride's mother, who revealed that her daughter was only 17 and too young to get married without her consent. So the couple reportedly did not contest the mother's suit to have the marriage annulled. So for 19 days, beginning on September 17th, a court of inquiry began examining testimony and evidence surrounding the disaster. Captain Watson accepted responsibility for the wrecks, but insisted his decisions were guided by decades of naval experience. He explained that the radio navigation report from Point Arguello had confused him. He said, when messages came telling me that we were north of Arguello, I couldn't believe it, he testified. We had traveled 120 miles since receiving our bearings earlier in the day. I did not believe it was possible that we were still north of Arguello. The court ultimately held Watson and the flagship's navigators responsible for the disaster, while also recognizing the heroism of 23 officers and men in saving all the ships, the people that ran aground. The inquiry recommended that 11 officers be bound over for a general court-martial, marking the largest single group of officers ever tried in Navy history. After weeks of hearings, 3 officers were found guilty. Captain Watson, the squadron navigator, Lieutenant Commander Donald Hunter, and Lieutenant Commander H.O. Roche, who was the skipper of the Nicholas. The remaining 8 officers were swiftly acquitted, with one deliberation taking as little as 15 minutes, and later a rear admiral overturned Roche's conviction. But Watson and Hunter, meanwhile, were never able to regain their careers. They lost all eligibility for future promotions and would never command ships again. They went on to various jobs to basically park them for a few years in the Navy, and they had both retired by 1929. Even after the official verdict was assigning blame came out, the public remained fascinated by the many contributing factors behind the tragedy. At his court-martial, the squadron navigator, Lieutenant Commander Hunter, suggested 2 unusual theories: the abnormal currents caused by the recent Japanese earthquake, or magnetic disturbances from a solar eclipse. He thought that might have thrown off the ship's compasses. The Press Courier quoted an experienced channel captain who reported that as he sailed past Honda Point on that Saturday afternoon, his compass readings were off by 10 miles. He was convinced that some sort of electrical disturbance had affected the instruments. And the Simi Valley Star also reported another veteran coastal pilot suspected the destroyers had been drawn to their doom by an underground river. He said years earlier he had experimented with the currents at Honda Point. He would sink driftwood at different depths from his ship. The deeper pieces reach shore faster than those on the surface. He theorized that there was an underground river that flows out to sea towards Honda Beach and passes under Arguello and runs beneath the surface of the Santa Barbara Channel. But perhaps the most unusual coincidence came from a Simi Valley newspaper that reported on a note discovered at an Ojai dry goods store. Hal Dieterich, who was the chairman of the Santa Barbara Board of Supervisors at the time, he worked for the Hickey Brothers store, and recalled that 3 weeks before the accident, a clerk had found a rough drawn map of the Pacific tucked into a shipment. A line ran from San Francisco about 2/3 of the way to Los Angeles, stopping essentially near Honda Point. In the margin, someone had written 3 weeks from Saturday, lots of ships, plenty of trouble. Ooh. Dietrich wisely kept the note secret until after the disaster, adding it as a postscript to the public's fascination with the event. So on October 4th, the USS Fuller slipped beneath the waves, leaving only 4 of the 7 destroyers visible on the reef. Over the following weeks, the life preservers and other debris from the wrecks were carried by strong currents for hundreds of miles, and at that point, some of them did wash up along Ventura County beaches near the Rincon Causeway. The heaviest swells in 40 years basically battered the remaining battleships, tearing them apart. Within a month, only 3 of the remaining destroyers, the Lee, the Chauncey, and the Woodbury, still protruded above the water, although all were listing badly and were expected to be destroyed by the first severe storm of the year. By the end of 1924, the ships had been reduced to scattered fragments. After stripping the wrecks of anything of value, the Navy put the remnants up for salvage. In December, a Santa Monica salvage company was the only bidder for all 7 destroyers, offering $1,650, which is about $30,000 in today's money. In the end, it was the sea that carried away most of the ships. Some pieces remain underwater today. Vandenberg Space Force Base actually controls the site, and it's accessible by permission only. The wrecks are, interestingly, some of the least dived in California, maybe because it's such an awful place. The site is protected by law, and of course, artifacts cannot be removed. There is a plaque at the site of the crash honoring those who lost their lives. The area around Honda Point is not easily accessible, and if you're interested in seeing it, it's probably best viewed from the Amtrak train. If you're taking the Amtrak train south, you can see it. Over 100 years later, mariners are still relieved when they safely pass the Devil's Jaw, and it could be perhaps that they hear the words of Channel Captain R.P. McChesney, who wrote in 1923, "Whenever I pass that spot, I stand on deck and take off my hat, not only in respect to the greatness of the forces that exist there, but also in gratitude that once more I am safely by the most dangerous places on the California coast." So, that's it. If you're interested in some of the other stories that I've written, I think I've written 27 of them now. I'm trying to compete with Stu in output. You can go to that URL there. Are there any questions? Okay. Go.
Have they done any testing to see if there's an underground river there, or anything?
There was no evidence that there any validity to that. I mean, I'm sure there's underwater currents and that sort of thing, but nothing that would cause what it appears all the other, the navigational errors and the rough seas are really what caused this and the fog, which caused this problem. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that there's nothing new about conspiracy theories or conspiracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things I've learned from writing all the articles that I've written is everything gets repeated over and over again. You'd think we would learn what's going on, but we don't really seem to. Yeah, Linda.
I saw the lighthouse there.
What's that?
I saw a lighthouse.
Yeah, there is a lighthouse. I think that's at Port Arguello.
It wasn't working?
I don't know the status of it today, but that was where the radio direction finding thing is, and there's probably still some sort of navigational aid at that spot, because if you'll recall from the map that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, that it's situated right there at the tip before you enter the Santa Barbara Channel. So it's a critical spot to get a reading. Yes?
Have there been any other significant shipwrecks there?
You know, not that I know of. I know there's been a few individual ships that have been wrecked by, like, the Ventura Wharf and some other places, but nothing on the scale of this. But I'm not an expert on all shipwrecks either.
How did you learn about this, and why haven't we heard this story before? Is there a reason?
Well, you know, when I look for stories that I write for the museum, I try to find things that haven't had a lot of people writing about, because I just think it's boring. And so I was looking through newspapers. We have some bound books, you know, big giant books that are basically newspapers. And so sometimes I'll just thumb through those looking to see what people were doing 100 years ago, or something like that. And I happened to come across all these stories talking about people going out and seeing the shipwrecks. And so then they did some research. And if you go online, you can find things about it, but I do think it hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention, certainly in Ventura County or even Santa Barbara history. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a, I mean, technically the site is in Santa Barbara County, but it really became a fascination for the people of Ventura County as well. So, yes, Bill.
The boating community is usually quite aware of the general gist of the story.
Uh-huh.
Nothing to the level of detail.
No, okay. But they know to stay away from it.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah, I remember my father-in-law just dreaded sailing by that location and was.
With GPS, thank God.
Yeah.
It's very easy to maintain a very healthy distance.
Yeah. I mean, you can see why the captains were not necessarily 100% on board with the radio direction finding equipment when you have the 180-degree ambiguity problem, and when you have interference from either the surface of the water or from all the metal rigging on the ships. So there were plenty of things to kind of mess things up, but you'd think you'd kind of put two things together, and if one is giving you a warning sign, maybe you'd be a little more cautious. And it seemed the Navy didn't side with the captain, that he made the right decision, so.
Well, it's typical navigation theory is that you use two sources of information to fix your position, regardless of what else is going on.
Right.
And dead reckoning is not one of those sources.
Right. And unfortunately, they couldn't, because of if you remember, because of the fog, they couldn't look and see if they could get any sort of visual bearing or see the shore or anything like that. So they were really blind and had very few things that they could trust. So. Yes, sir.
There was a book written about this. I read it about 20 years ago because a friend of mine went to Vandenberg and saw on it once, and he said, "You got to read the book about this."
Yeah.
So, why didn't they just use GPS?
I think the internet was down.
Must have been Cloudflare again.
Yeah.
Or solar flare, yeah.
It's that underground river, actually.
Yeah, right. The underground river. I like the note myself. That sounds very X-Files. I like that. So, all right. Well, thank you.